Congo, as we all know, has been a Belgian colony for nearly a century. In all those years, Belgium applied a system of calculated political castration in the hope that it would be completely impossible for African nationalists to fight for their emancipation. But to the dismay of Belgium, and to the surprise of everyone outside the African continent, this dreaded nationalism appeared, and with a lightening space and time, secured the independence of the Congo. The policy of political frustration pursued by the Belgian colonial regime created a situation in which the Belgian administration was unable to continue, while at the same time, no Congolese has been trained to take over and run the state. The struggle for independence in the Congo is the shortest so far recorded, and the Belgians were so overtaken by events that they pulled out, but fully expected to return in one way or another. The high positions in the army, the police, and the public services have been the exclusive reserves of the Belgians. No African could hope to rise to the lowest commission rank in the army. The whole of the Force Publique was subject to extremely harsh discipline and had a very low rates of pay. This situation made it impossible to build up a cadre of indigenous personnel to man the services. As soon as an African became Minister of Defense, the incongruous position of the African in the Force Publique became evident. Great discontent resulted. Even so, the situation might not have erupted had the Belgian commander of the Force Publique adopted a realistic attitude towards the men and made any attempt to redress the legitimate grievances of the Congolese soldiers. Even a promise of future reform might have done some good. On the contrary, emphatic statements were indiscreetly made by Belgian officers that nothing had changed and that life would go on much the same way as before independence. In short, the soldiers were told that independence was a sham and that Belgium still wielded the big stick. This produced the mutiny. When the mutiny occurred, large numbers of Belgians began to leave the country. The President of the Republic, Mr. Kasavubu, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Lumumba, went to Matadi in order to appeal to the Belgians to remain. But instead, they were all taken on board ships on the advice of the Belgian consul, while the town was machine-gunned from the air by the Belgian military aircraft and shelled from the sea. Despite the fact that there were no Belgian civilians whatever to protect, Belgian troops entered the town and shot in cold blood a number of unarmed police and civilians. What has happened in the Congo has more than justified my continuous outcry against the threat of balkanization in Africa, and more than justified my daily condemnation of new colonialism, the process of handing independence over to the African people with one hand, only to take it away with the other hand. The Congo question is a test case for Africa. What is happening in the Congo today may happen in any other part of Africa tomorrow. And what the United Nations does today must set a precedent or a pattern for what it may have to do tomorrow. The United Nations will be judged by the success or failure of its handling of this Congo situation. Certain propositions seems to me to be self-evident. The first of these is that the United Nations need not go to the assistance of any country which invites its intervention, but that once it has done so, it owes an obligation to the government and people of that country not to intervene in such a way as to prevent the legitimate government which invited it to enter the country from fulfilling its mandate. In other words, it is impossible for the United Nations at the same time to preserve law and order and to be neutral between the legal authorities and the lawbreakers. It is unfortunately exactly this which the United Nations has attempted to do in the case of the Congo, and which, in the cause of all, is the cause of all the present difficulties and disagreements. My second proposition is that in any sovereign state, there can be only one national army. If a soldier disobeys the superior officer and owes and uses his arms to murder and to loot, he is a mutineer. There is, however, no difference between his position and that of a colonel who disregards the authority which appointed him and uses the troops under his own command for his own purposes. The United Nations, in enforcing law and order, must deal equally sternly with either of these two types of mutineer. The failure, or rather this failure by the United Nations, is to distinguish between legal and illegal authorities, had led to the most ridiculous result, embarrassing both the Ghanaian forces who were called upon to carry them out, and to the United Nations itself, which was exhibited in a ridiculous light. First, the Congo, including Katanga and Kasai, is one and indivisible. Any other approach is mere wishful thinking, for not all the mineral wealth in that integral part of the Congo can create Katanga as a separate state. The crisis in the Congo must be arrested now before it sparks off another world conflagration. The Sun powers do not appear to realize the gravity of the situation and are playing with fire by attempting to use the United Nations as a cloak for their own aims. I personally and my government have done everything possible to assist and advise the leaders of the Congo to resolve their differences and place their countries and Africa's interests first. Both of them, President Kasavubu and the Prime Minister Lumumba, speak the same language of peace and unity. Both of them are anxious to see stability achieved in their country. Both of them agree to reconciliation. What then prevents them from coming together? What has led to the fake Mobutu episode? I can assure distinguished delegates that for the intrigues of the colonialists, a document of reconciliation which has been drafted in the presence of my ambassador in Libreville and approved by both Mr. Lukasabubu and Mr. Mbumba could have been signed by them. Imperialist intrigue, stark and naked, was desperately at work to prevent this being signed. The policy of divide and rule is still being practiced energetically by the opponents of African independence and unity. Mr. President and distinguished delegates, it is quite clear that a desperate attempt is being made to create confusion in the Congo, extend the Cold War to Africa, and involve Africa in the suicidal quarrels of foreign powers. The United Nations must not allow this to happen. We, for our part, will not allow this to happen. That is why we are anxious that the United Nations, having reached a point where intervention on the side of the legitimate government of the Congo appears to be the obvious and only answer to this crisis, should act boldly through the medium of the independent African states. Let these African states act under the canopy of the United Nations and produce the effect result. In these particular circumstances, the Congo crisis should be handed over to the independent African state for solution. I'm sure that left to them, an effective solution can be found. It is negative to believe and hesitate until the situation becomes irredeemable and develops into another Korea. I would go further and suggest that all financial aid or technical assistance to the Congo Republic should be arranged only with the legitimate government of the Congo Republic, channeled through the United Nations and guaranteed and supervised by a committee of the independent African states appointed by the Security Council, who should be accountable to the United Nations.